Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Episode 2. They said it wouldn't last.
Hey, thanks for coming back to episode 2, guys.
We're excited to dive into some more stories from Hollywood. I have been thinking this week about the first time that I came to Hollywood. I was in college. I hadn't moved here yet, but it was my first time walking down Hollywood Boulevard. I was in a daze. I was shocked by what I was seeing.
Yes.
And I eventually got hungry, and I thought, where's a safe place to go eat? And so I wandered into this restaurant that, unbeknownst to me at the time, was Musso and Frank.
Oh.
So one of the most iconic
Yes.
restaurants in Hollywood, probably the most, again popularized by Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Quentin Tarantino. Thank you so much. Now you can't get a reservation.
Yes.
But I was wondering about your first moments in Hollywood.
Well, it's funny. I moved to Los Angeles in the late 80s, and Hollywood was very different back then, as you probably know. It was this just land of decayed decadence. On one block, you have the El Capitan Theater, and then you have the most horrible T-shirt shops and souvenir shops and homeless people and drug addicts and prostitutes. It was this weird dichotomy of just once beautiful, architecture, and now what had come. So it was a weird first introduction to Hollywood.
Yeah. And I think the skyline, too, certainly the Hollywood sign is still there and has gone through some iterations. But the skyline itself, there is one prominent building that's still there. Well, 2. Capitol Records is still there.
Absolutely, which is iconic. But I think the other one, and it's what we'll talk about today, because it has a very sordid history, is the Knickerbocker Hotel, which I don't know if many people are familiar with it, but if you're driving around Hollywood, even today, you turn up Ivar, and there's this huge 11-story, boxy, blah, sort of nothing building that has these beautiful illuminated letters on top that say Knickerbocker Hotel. And I'm sure people are wondering, what is that place?
Right.
We're going to tell you.
We're going to tell you. When was it built?
Well, it was originally constructed in 1923. It was designed by an architect named E.M. Fraser. But it took them years to complete. It had all kinds of fits and starts, and they ran out of money. They started again, new ownership. It finally opened in, I believe it was July of 1929, just in time for the stock market crash in September.
Of course. Great.
But in spite of that, almost immediately it became a hub. It became a hot spot for Hollywood. There was a jazz club there called the Lido Room. Everybody went there. It was the place to go, to be seen, to network.
Who would we see in 1939 on any given night?
Well,
with a martini in their hand, no doubt.
Of course. Well, any given night you would see anybody there. But there were some famous actors who actually lived there. They took residency up there. For a while, Bette Davis lived there. Dick Powell lived there. Maureen O'Sullivan lived there for a long time.
Wow.
And also Mae West, before she moved to the Ravenwood, which is her famous apartment where she died, she lived briefly in the Knickerbocker. So it has, a very celebrity-laden past of occupants.
There were also some very celebratory events that happened there that involved a lot of famous people as well, correct?
Yes. It was sort of a go-to place for banquets and dinners and parties. They had these beautiful banquet rooms that were just gorgeous, that really highlighted the Spanish colonial revival architecture, which was prevalent then. But, Howard Hughes would have business dinners there. Cecil B. DeMille would have parties there. But one famous one happened in 1935 when America's favorite pinup girl with the $1 million legs, Betty Grable, she hosted this very elaborate birthday party. It was the 21st birthday party for her boyfriend and future husband, Jackie Coogan.
Wow.
And for people who may not remember Jackie Coogan, he was a child actor, and he is the reason that all child actors today are protected. At least their money's protected from the greedy parents because his parents weren't so kind with his money. We now have Coogan laws, which protects kids, and they have to set up a trust fund, and their money's protected, and things like that.
Thank you, Jackie Coogan.
Thank you, Jackie Coogan.
And also for people of a certain generation, you might remember Jackie Coogan as Uncle Fester on the TV show The Addams Family.
So that was Betty Grable's husband.
Tell me who Speck was.
Speck was fantastic. I wish I could have seen Speck. As sort of a gimmick, the hotel manager, Jack Matthews, he had this English setter dog, and the name was Speck. Well, to kind of entertain the guests, he taught Speck how to operate the elevator. Speck would go in.
We need to teach Sally that, and you need to teach Myrna, our two doggies.
Oh, absolutely. If only Myrna could do something so useful. So he taught Speck to stand on his hind legs, and with his paw, he would hit the floor button. So, he could basically operate the elevator. And he was very polite. He always let the guests enter and exit first, and then he would go. But the funny thing is, he would never bark. He'd done elevator duty. It was time to go back to his master's apartment, which was on the 3rd floor, I believe. He never scratched the door. He never barked. He rang the doorbell because that's what he was taught.
Because that's what he was taught.
So
Wow.
Speck was quite the scene around the Knickerbocker for a while.
Wow. Last week we were talking about our memories of watching old movies as a kid. And one of the ones that popped into my head this week is the movie Houdini with Tony Curtis.
Yes.
Janet Leigh playing his wife. Such a fabulous film.
Great movie. What a performance. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Well.
tell us about
Funny you should mention Houdini because, of course, Houdini has sort of something to do with the Knickerbocker Hotel. And it's funny because this is when the Knickerbocker Hotel started to get sort of a sordid history of sort of the dark and the interesting. What happened was before Houdini died, I think he died at 52 on Halloween night of 1926, he promised his wife, Bess, that after he died, if there really was an afterlife, he would come back and visit her. So for 10 years, Bess would hold an annual seance to bring back Harry. No luck, no luck, no luck. And so finally, on the 10th year anniversary, she decided to hold the annual seance on the rooftop of the Knickerbocker Hotel. And it became like a spectacular, this press spectacular. Everybody was there, cameras.
Wow.
Everything. She had, trumpets and velvet pillows and all these things that were supposedly to help with the seance. Of course, Harry was a no-show.
Oh, darn it.
For the 10th year in a row.
And did she continue to have them after that, or was that the last one?
She did not. That was it. I think she figured after 10 years, maybe there was no afterlife.
Right.
I don't know.
And I would imagine that a lot of people took advantage of her belief that he would show up and were probably bilking her for some money.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think definitely so.
Well, this sordid past continues on with what you call the unlucky 7. Can you talk about that?
Oh, the unlucky 7, which actually will bring in someone that we spoke about in our first episode. But in 1935, Paramount Pictures, sort of as a publicity stunt, they selected 7 starlets, actresses from their roster, contract players, not anybody who'd done much yet. And they picked them to be the lucky 7. They were the 7 actresses that they thought had potential, were going to go on to be great big stars. And unfortunately, the moniker, the lucky 7, ended up being probably more ironic because of the 7, 5 of them had 0 careers. I mean, they
didn't even appear really in anything?
They did appear, but
Okay.
they had careers that just really weren't spectacular at all. And those 5, it was Eleanor Whitney, Rosalind Keith, Jane Rhodes, Olympie Branda, who was a French dancer.
Okay.
Betty Burgess. Any of those names ring a bell?
No. Any films that they were in that even if they had a small part, we would go, oh, I know that film title? Or were they really just in small pictures
Mostly
as well?
small pictures. I mean, Eleanor Whitney made a few films that you might recall her. Rosalind Keith also. The others, nothing.
Okay.
You would never, I could never point to a movie. Oh, that scene with the car hop girl that's so funny, that's Betty Burgess.
Yeah.
Can't think of it.
Okay. Well, what about the other 2 of the 7?
Well, the other 2 actually did achieve fame. They both did in their own rights. The first one, who was the sixth member of that sorority, was Marcia Hunt. And a little personal note about Marcia Hunt. When I first moved to California, for a brief time, I lived in Sherman Oaks, California. And my neighbor a block away was Marcia Hunt.
Wow.
And my great friend Ann Rutherford, who's the actress from Gone with the Wind, who I call my fairy godmother because she's partially responsible for me coming to California, which is a whole nother story for another episode. But Anne knew that Marcia and I were neighbors, so she played little neighbor matchmaker. So she connected Marcia and I, and we became lifelong friends. She became one of my dearest friends, my most cherished confidants. We did Hollywood together.
And you knew who she was in Hollywood history.
I did.
Yeah.
I knew Marcia because, and people would know Marcia from, she was the hilarious Mary in Pride and Prejudice, the 1940 version with Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier and Maureen O'Sullivan. She was in Blossoms in the Dust with Greer Garson. She did a lot of Greer Garson movies, and she actually didn't like Greer that much. But, I'm speaking out of school.
Yeah. Well, she's okay.
And she made the great, film noir Raw Deal with Claire Trevor. But, she became a star. But unfortunately, she was one of the victims of the blacklist in the early 50s. And she wasn't a communist. She had no interest in communism. She was just a very liberal, politically, woman. And she was very vocal in her beliefs. She really thought that we should take care of the homeless and we should take care of the poor and we should, all these things that were considered very liberal beliefs back then.
So she was blacklisted.
She was blacklisted. She and her husband both were blacklisted. And it's funny, she was in Europe when it happened. And before she had gone to Europe, I think a couple of networks, CBS and NBC, were interested in her doing a show, like the Marcia Hunt show. By the time she got back from Europe, the ball had dropped and it was over. She did not work for many, many years. She did work, eventually again, but her career was so on the move and it was stopped on a dime.
Right. And was she open in talking with you about that period of her life?
Absolutely. She went on to be a real historian about the blacklist, and she would lecture about it. She would speak at the academy. She was very open and honest about it and had no issue talking about it at all. But the beauty is, Marcia ended up taking the lemons, and she totally made lemonade out of her life.
Yes.
She ended up going on being an advocate for homeless, and she helped set up homeless shelters in the Valley, and she was the honorary mayor of Sherman Oaks, and she worked with the United Nations. And her philanthropy work, Google it, is unbelievable. And if you haven't seen it, my friend Roger Mimos has an incredible documentary that came out in 2014 called Marcia Hunt, Sweet Adversity. And it's really worth checking out because you really see the scope of this beautiful, beautiful woman and what she did with her life after the blacklist.
Yeah. So we have the final number 7 in our unlucky 7.
Well, the number 7 brings us back to our first episode, and the 7th member of the unlucky 7 was Frances Farmer.
Frances Farmer.
I know, which I know has a special place in your heart.
Yes, we talked last week. If you missed last week's episode, our first episode, we talked about Jessica Lange in the 1982 film Frances, and the photo of Frances Farmer that's actually on the website is very reminiscent of Jessica Lange's performance and the rawness of it, and what Frances Farmer went through.
Absolutely. And when I think about Frances Farmer, I think it's sad that she's now better known for her personal problems than she is for her work, because she was an incredible actress. Yes. She was in, Rhythm in the Range with opposite Bing Crosby, which really put her on the map. And then she went back to New York and got involved with the group theater with Lee Strasberg. I don't know if many people know this, but she originated the role in Golden Boy that Barbara Stanwyck made famous on film in 1939.
Wow.
She was the original person. And also, this will tie us to episode 1, too. So back in New York, when Frances was appearing in Golden Boy, she had an affair with Clifford Odets, the playwright, who at the time was married to Louise Reiner.
Wow. Louise is back again.
You can't shake Louise Reiner.
No. We have many more stories to talk about with the Knickerbocker Hotel, but right now, it's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz. Steve, take it away.
We all know about the great Tony Curtis, Janet Leigh movie, Houdini. But there was also a 1976 TV movie made about Houdini. Who starred as Harry Houdini? And you'll get bonus points if you can tell me who starred as Bess, his wife.
Oh, this is a good one. Again, no fair Googling. We'll be right back, and we'll have the answer to our pop quiz and more stories from the Knickerbocker Hotel.
Steve and Nan will be right back. But first, another stop on the Hollywood tour. The very first movie studio built in Hollywood was the Nestor Film Company, which was the West Coast branch of the Centaur Film Company out of Bayonne, New Jersey. It opened its doors on October 27, 1911, and was located in the Blondo Tavern building on the northwest corner of Sunset and Gower. In May of 1912, it merged with the Universal Film Manufacturing Company, headed by Carl Laemmle. Now back to Steve and Ann.
To finish up the connection to Frances Farmer and the Knickerbocker, tell us what happened.
Well, Frances actually lived at the Knickerbocker Hotel in the early 40s, and on January the 13th, 1943, the police showed up at her apartment because there was a warrant for her arrest on a drunk driving charge. Because, of course, Frances had many incidences with the police and run-ins with the police, and we all know about her tragedy. She wouldn't answer the door, even though they clearly knew she was there. They ended up using a pass key to get in, and they found her buck naked, screaming, in a manic state. They forcibly had to dress her, drag her out of the apartment, and they drug her through the lobby of the Knickerbocker Hotel. The whole time she's screaming and yelling and cursing while all the guests watch in horror. And they took her out to the squad car. And, and we all know what happened to her after that. She was institutionalized and eventually given an involuntary lobotomy, which is so tragic.
It's such a tragic story, what happened to her.
It really is. And it's funny, and I'll tie Marcia Hunt back in here again. Marcia loved Frances. They were very close back in the day at Paramount, and she thought she was one of the brightest, most intelligent, liveliest women she knew. She, didn't keep in touch with Frances during all the dark years, but in the early 60s, Marcia did a play in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Oh, wow.
And that's where Frances had settled. After the lobotomy, after all the tragedy, she had settled into a very quiet life in Indianapolis. I don't know why. But after the play, Frances had a talk show on the local cable station in Indianapolis called Frances Farmer Presents, I believe was the name of it. And she invited Marcia on as a guest. And so they got to have a reunion on Frances's show. And afterwards, Frances invited Marcia over to her house. And Marcia said it was this beautiful cottage with a white picket fence. It was so idyllic. It's probably the life Frances always wanted but never could have because of the tragedies. But she said that the Frances she knew was gone.
Wow.
She said that she was just vacant. She said that all the spark and the lively energy and all that, love of life that Frances had just been drained out of her, which I think is the most tragic part of the story of all.
It truly is.
Yeah.
It truly is. I had a wonderful teacher in college who I ended up being a teaching assistant for, and he taught a general education course on the history of film. And his name is Ron Perrier. And
shout out to Ron.
Shout out to Ron. He's a wonderful guy. And he's how I first learned about the next person we're going to talk about, who is D.W. Griffith.
Yes.
And his connection to the Knickerbocker.
Oh, absolutely. He definitely had a connection there. Well, yeah, as most people know, D.W. Griffith was probably one of the most influential directors in Hollywood, who started off pioneering director of Hollywood. He's probably most known for a couple of very controversial movies, Birth of a Nation in 1915 and Intolerance in 1916, which I'm just curious, what did Ron say about those movies?
Well, he really, remember, this was a while ago. And so they weren't so much considered controversial in the way that we view them now through our lens of, 2023. He really focused more on the fact that D.W. Griffith is really responsible for how we think of a narrative film right now and how we come to editing film now. And unfortunately, because Birth of a Nation has such controversial pieces to it, I think he's forgotten in some respects. He's not known for perhaps what he would hope to be known for.
Absolutely. I think he's forgotten too, which is really a shame. I know he had some controversial views on life, but that's, doesn't take away his artistry and what he contributed to Hollywood, I don't think. But anyway, he lived there in his later years because after he was forgotten, he just became this quiet, dotty old man who lived at the Knickerbocker Hotel.
And nobody knew who he was.
And nobody knew who he was. And interestingly enough, besides his great work as a director, Griffith founded United Artists Studios, along with Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. So, he was a real pioneer in Hollywood. That alone he should be remembered for. But, his later years, they were quiet years, and he lived there. He would always go in the lobby. He was always dressed to the nines with a suit and a hat, and he always had his cane, and just, sometimes maybe seemed a little confused. But he lived there until July the 23rd of 1948, when he collapsed in the hotel lobby beneath that grand chandelier, which is still there, by the way.
Oh, wow.
And that's where D.W. Griffith, the Great, passed away, right there in the Knickerbocker Hotel.
Wow. It's interesting. His forming United Artists with Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin was really very forward-thinking at the time, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And created independence for artists that they wouldn't necessarily have.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Sadly, it's funny, when D.W. Griffith had his funeral, nobody showed up. All the big stars that he'd helped, foster their careers, not many of them showed up, which was sad. He was just a long forgotten figure in Hollywood.
Wow. Well, here's someone from Hollywood that is not forgotten and is still can be found in the little stores and the little tchotchke stores on Hollywood Boulevard. And that is Marilyn Monroe. What is her connection to the Knickerbocker?
It's funny because in the 1950s, times had changed. Nobody was going to Hollywood. Everybody was moving to Beverly Hills and the West Side. So Hollywood became, not as glamorous, and it wasn't the go-to place anymore. And so the Knickerbocker, it wasn't the place you went to be seen anymore. It was a place you went to not be seen. And so, on those same lines, in 1954, Marilyn Monroe used to sneak through the kitchen of the Knickerbocker, and she would meet up with her lover, Joe DiMaggio, the Great, who would obviously later become her husband. And that was sort of their secret rendezvous place.
Wow.
And it was also a hiding out place a few years later in 1955 when Elvis Presley came to town to record his first album, the self-titled Elvis album, and shoot his first movie, Love Me Tender. He chose the Knickerbocker because all the screaming girls couldn't find him.
Right.
The
Very
place to
smart.
hide. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. The place to hide.
I don't know if people remember that TV show, This Is Your Life, where they would surprise you. The cameras would rush in and they'd bring up your third grade teacher.
Right. Sort of like the worst surprise party ever because it's broadcast in front of everyone.
Exactly. And it was live. Well, on December the 1st, 1954, a camera crew from This Is Your Life showed up at the Knickerbocker Hotel.
Oh, my.
In room 205, and inside were the iconic comedy duo Laurel and Hardy. They had no idea what was happening. They had just been lured there by some friends just to come and hang out and have a drink.
Wow.
And so the cameras rushed in. They both were livid. Both were very private people and did not like it one bit. I think it's on YouTube. If you ever go back and look at that episode, you can see the discomfort, especially on Stan Laurel. Just watch that and remember, they had no idea.
Oh, my gosh. Well,
all at the Knickerbocker.
All at the Knickerbocker, which just reminds me, I used to live, one of my very first apartments was right by the staircase where the piano episode.
Oh, in Silver Lake?
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. I've been there.
Tell me who Irene Lentz was.
Oh, Irene Lentz. Most people know her just by the singular name, Irene.
Yes. At vintage stores, I think you can even still find clothing with just Irene on it.
You can find Irene's clothes. Irene was, she started out as an actress. She was in a lot of Mack Sennett comedies. But she was a really good seamstress, and she really had an eye for design. So she started designing her own clothes. She opened a little shop. That led to her getting hired on at the Wilshire Bullock's department store. And that led to the studios calling. And they were looking for people who could design costumes for the movies. And she got pulled into basically designing those beautiful gowns and tuxedos for all of our favorite movie stars. But along the way, she married a screenwriter named Elliot Gibbons, who was the brother of the great production designer Cedric Gibbons, who was married to Dolores Del Rio, the movie star. So it's all incestuous.
Yeah, everybody knows everybody, right?
Right. So, so soon Irene is just one of the hottest costume designers in movies. She's designing costumes for Constance Bennett and Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck, Paulette Goddard, Rosalind Russell, Joan Bennett, Hedy Lamarr, Carole Lombard. Ingrid Bergman. I mean, the list goes on and on. She was just like the biggest thing in costume design.
And what is the clothing that she designed that we would really all know?
She designed very tailored looks for women, which I think is why really strong actresses like Barbara Stanwyck and Joan Crawford were drawn to her.
Yes.
It was that great tweed suit that's tailored with sharp shoulders and crisp skirts and things like that.
The silhouette just says power suit,
Yeah,
right?
the power suit.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think she was the original creator of the power suit.
Right.
But she also created those sexy clothes that Lana Turner wore in The Postman Always Rings Twice.
Oh, yes.
The bare midriff halter tops with the Bermuda shorts and things like that.
Which is very popular now, by the way.
So Irene was ahead of her time.
She very much was. And also Midnight Lace, another one of my favorite films with Doris Day.
Yeah, which she actually was Oscar nominated for Midnight Lace. She had been previously nominated for B.F.'s Daughter in 1948 with Barbara Stanwyck, but Midnight Lace, Doris was a great friend of her and sort of lured her out of retirement to come back and do
Midnight Lace.
Midnight Lace.
Wow.
But things don't go so well for Irene, and it's one of the more tragic stories, I think, that happened at the Knickerbocker. By 1961, her husband had a stroke. There were terrible medical bills. She had fallen under depression. They were having financial issues. And so on November the 15th, 1962, Irene checked into room 1129 under an assumed name. She started drinking heavily once she got in there, and she wrote a couple of suicide notes. She had decided that she couldn't take it anymore. One of her notes, which just breaks your heart, she wrote, "I am sorry to do this in this manner. Please see that Elliot is taken care of. Take care of the business and get someone very good to design. Love, Irene."
Oh.
So then she proceeded to slit her wrist, but that didn't take. So she crawled out of the bathroom window on the 11th floor of the Knickerbocker Hotel, and she plunged to her death.
On the street on Ivar.
Well, she actually landed on the awning between the two buildings. So she landed about on the 4th floor, and someone down there heard, and they investigated, and there she was. And the saddest part of all is, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but Doris Day wrote in her biography that Irene confessed privately to her that part of her sadness and depression was due to the death of her unrequited love the year before, which was Gary Cooper.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
wow.
So a lot of interesting things there with Irene.
Yes. Lucille Ball has certainly been on our minds and hearts of late with the film being done about her and then that wonderful documentary that was done. I was on a trip to New York City and I saw Lucy Arnaz sitting in the waiting room to get on the flight.
I love Lucy Arnaz.
And I so wanted to say something to her and I thought, don't bother her. And then I saw her on the flight, but we weren't in the same area of the plane, if you know what I mean. And I didn't say anything then. And then I got off the plane at JFK and we got in the same elevator. And it was me.
It was meant to be.
Yes. And her husband. And
Lawrence Luckinbill.
Yes. And so I said, Miss Arnaz, I just have to tell you, I'm a huge fan of yours and your parents. And she could not have been kinder. And then when Lawrence, I think does she call him Lawrence or Larry?
I don't know.
Anyway, when Lawrence came on, she said, "This is Nan. She's a big fan of ours and my parents." And we were like old chums.
Don't you love that?
Yeah.
When you meet somebody who's just genuine and nice.
Yes, she was a great gal. So that all brings us to Mr. William Frawley, our last story here with the Knickerbocker.
Fred Merz himself.
Yes.
Actually, Fred lived at the Knickerbocker Hotel, which seems like a perfect place for Fred Merz to live.
It kind of does. How many years, do you know how many years he lived there?
He lived there about 30 years. So he was a long time tenant there, was very well known around the place. But how he's tied into the Knickerbocker today is on March 3rd of 1966, he had gone to a movie on Hollywood Boulevard. He had since left the Knickerbocker and he was living at the El Royale apartments, but he had gone to the movie. He was walking down Hollywood Boulevard and he suffered a heart attack, pretty debilitating. So his nurse who was with him, she actually helped him get to the lobby of the Knickerbocker Hotel, and that's where they called the ambulance. So a lot of people say he died at the Knickerbocker. I don't think he did. I think he died either en route to the hospital or at the hospital, but he's now forever tied to the Knickerbocker because he was such a long-term resident and because he collapsed or was, partially taken to the Knickerbocker Hotel after he collapsed. So tied into Fred Merz too.
And the Knickerbocker now, you have a connection to.
I do have a connection to the Knickerbocker Hotel because I've always been fascinated by it. And for a few years, I delivered meals for Meals on Wheels. And we had several clients who lived in the Knickerbocker Hotel because in the 70s, it was turned into low-income housing. But I got to go inside to deliver meals, and it was very bittersweet because there's some things there that are just the same. The chandelier, the beautiful wood of the elevator, but just that decayed element is gone. The floors are now linoleum. There's literally a bulletproof booth around the front desk. So it's, you got to see what it probably used to be and what it is now. And it was very, very bittersweet, but It was fun to be inside. You could almost feel the ghosts wandering around.
I was just going to say the spirits of old Hollywood live on.
Absolutely.
I think it's time to get the answer to our Hollywood pop quiz. Just as a reminder, the question was, in 1976, there was a TV movie made about Houdini. Who starred as Houdini in that film? And bonus points if you know who played Bess, his wife.
And the answer is two very great TV stars at the time. Houdini was played by Paul Michael Glaser from Starsky and Hutch, and Bess was played by Sally Struthers from All in the Family.
Wow.
How about that for a coupling?
That is an interesting couple.
Right?
I'm just picturing that right now.
I know. It's a good movie, though.
I'm going to have to check out that movie. Steve, that's a wrap on episode 2. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at info@frombeneaththehollywoodsign.com. We have many more great stories for you coming up.
So that's this week's View.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Kubine and Nan McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review. And tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Kubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebly. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebly and Toth. Copyright 2023. All rights reserved. That's a wrap.